Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are plunging into uh, a really fascinating collection of sources surrounding a major event, the No Kings protests that swept across the U.S. on June 14th.
Yeah, and we've pulled from a really diverse stack. News outlets like Newsweek, The Economic Times, Truth Out, the New Haven Independent, plus, insights from online discussions, a deep dive into community organizing theory,
Right.
a sharp classical liberal reframe, and even a look back at the history of monarchism in the U.S. It's quite a mix.
It is a lot to sift through, and our mission here is to, well, cut through all that noise. We want to pull out the essential insights, understand the different angles people are taking, and figure out what this moment kind of reveals about the current political landscape.
Exactly. Think of this as your curated guide, really, to being well-informed in the No Kings movement. We're trying to give you the context, the surprising details, and the various lenses people are viewing it through.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Where do we start? What actually happened on that day?
Okay, let's set the scene. June 14th was a nationwide day of protest. It was explicitly called the No Kings Day of Defiance by the people organizing it.
And the timing wasn't just random, was it? It felt very deliberate.
Oh, absolutely. June 14th has, well, multiple layers of significance. It's Flag Day, it was the Army's 250th birthday, and it just happened to be President Trump's 79th birthday. So the protests were planned precisely to contrast with that big military parade scheduled in Washington, D.C.
And I saw the organizing effort was under the banner 5501 movement. What does that signify?
Right, that name, according to the sources, symbolizes 50 states, 50 protests, all coming together as one movement. And the early estimates on the scale were quite striking.
How striking.
Well, suggesting millions attended nationwide across nearly 2,000 cities and towns.
Millions. Wow. That kind of scale is really something. Did the sources give specific examples of turnout beyond just, the big number?
They did, yeah. One report estimated maybe 1 million people in Boston alone.
1 million in Boston.
Yeah, and a source on Reddit pointed out that's like twice the size of the largest single Tea Party protest day back in 2009.
Okay.
But what's also significant is that the turnout wasn't just limited to large, traditionally progressive cities. Sources reported substantial numbers in smaller towns, even in areas that tend to lean Republican, like Dallas-Fort Worth, Oklahoma City, Placerville, Woodland out in California. Some of the online discussion showed surprise at that, actually.
That detail about smaller towns is really interesting. And overall, what was the general character of these events? Were they peaceful?
For the most part, yeah. The sources described the protests as largely peaceful across the country. The organizing body itself, on its website, explicitly stated a commitment to nonviolent action and de-escalation.
So the intent was peaceful. But did events on the ground always follow that intent? Did things get tense anywhere?
Not everywhere stayed calm, according to the reports. Chicago, for instance, was described as entirely peaceful. Sources noted it took up something like 15 city blocks, many protesters carrying American flags, focusing on issues like deploying troops in cities and the need for due process and immigration stuff.
Okay, peaceful in Chicago. And in New Haven, the reports highlighted more of a diversity of issues being woven together.
Yes, exactly. The New Haven Independent piece detailed how the event there touched on, well, everything from immigration and policing to queer and gender solidarity, labor issues, international support for Palestine. It included some powerful personal stories, too.
Like what?
Someone dressed as a Handmaid's Tale character, apparently motivated by the military response she saw in L.A. and women's rights issues. A teacher showing solidarity with students affected by immigration policies. Even a German immigrant who was drawing parallels to WWII resistance. The march route there apparently filled the roads.
Those personal connections really bring it home. Now, you mentioned L.A. You said that was maybe an exception to the general peacefulness. What happened there?
Yeah, Los Angeles was highlighted as an epicenter of tension. Despite the organizers' commitment to nonviolence, sources noted the continued presence of the National Guard and Marines. There were even reports mentioning they were initially posing for photos with protesters.
Posing for photos, and that dynamic shifted.
It seemed so. Accounts from Truth Out described a point where police issued dispersal orders, but then reports say they began kettling people, basically trapping them, right, so they couldn't leave.
Uh-huh.
And following this, tear gas and less than lethal munitions were reportedly fired, which some sources described as unprovoked.
And that led to injuries. People got hurt.
Yes, reports detailed injuries. There was one account of an elderly man reportedly trampled by a police horse and then beaten. Other reports mentioned officers hitting people, sort of indiscriminately, The whole atmosphere in LA sounds quite different from Chicago or New Haven.
Yeah.
Protesters there were seen carrying a real mix of signs anti-Trump, Mexican flags, Palestinian flags, sometimes even upside-down U.S. flags, and chanting things like ACE out of L.A. and this is what democracy looks like.
So despite the broad, peaceful nature overall, specific flashpoints like LA really illustrate the tensions simmering just beneath the surface. And what about that flagship rally outside of D.C.? Where was that?
That was held in Philadelphia, deliberately positioned, the sources say, to serve as a kind of visual and symbolic counterpoint to the military parade happening back in the Capitol.
Okay, so that gives us a clearer picture of what unfolded on June 14th across the country. But the core of this movement, that slogan, No Kings, it really points to the why. What was the central motivation driving people into the streets, according to these sources?
Well, the fundamental motivation, as presented by organizers and participants in the sources we looked at, was a pushback against what they see as the increasingly authoritarian style of the Trump administration. There's a stated fear that he's actively steering the country away from its democratic foundations, its norms.
And what specific actions or policies were fueling this perception? What were the key grievances people cited again and again?
Several specific issues came up repeatedly. The deployment of troops to American cities, often against the wishes of local mayors or governors, was a really big one.
Right.
The perceived lack of due process in immigration enforcement was another huge point. Sources cited examples like C-caught detainees. Those are people held at customs and enforcement contract facilities, sometimes without charges or access to a lawyer. Family separations, of course, were also a significant grievance mentioned.
And the overall style of the administration, that seemed to be a factor too, not just specific policies.
Absolutely. The administration's aggressive tactics were described by some sources as being all over the place, maybe a marked contrast to the approach under the previous administration, ignoring judges and judicial orders, constantly pushing the perceived limits of executive power. Those are also listed as major concerns.
You mentioned due process specifically. Were there other examples related to that people brought up?
Yes. Sources gave some very specific examples, like the reported deportation of an American child without allowing the father to contest custody first, or the detention of people wrongly identified. There was also mention of daily quotas for deportations, the worry being that this could lead to, hasty decisions and mistakes. And those deportations ASMR tweets referring to social media posts from the administration that seemed to almost, take satisfaction in detailing deportations were cited by one source as evidence that the administration appeared to revel in the suffering of others.
So a deep concern about the rule of law and maybe human dignity, at least as perceived by these groups, and the military parade itself, that was tied into these grievances too.
Oh, definitely. The parade was viewed by organizers and participants as a blatant misuse of power for personal spectacle. It was described as costly, wasteful, and un-American. President Trump's rhetoric also played a role. For example, his comments calling those planning to protest people that hate the country seemed to deeply offend some participants. They explicitly carried American flags, sources said, to demonstrate that they felt they were just as patriotic as his supporters.
Looking at the organizers' stated list of grievances, it really sounds like they felt a fundamental shift was happening in the country.
They did. Their website listed perceived actions like defying courts, deporting Americans, disappearing people off the streets, attacking civil rights, slashing services. All of this, they argued, was happening while the administration served, in their view, the interests of billionaires.
Which brings us right back to that slogan, No Kings. It's clearly metaphorical, right? What does it really mean in this context?
It's absolutely metaphorical, yeah. Sources explain it's basically a statement against what they see as authoritarian tendencies, acting above the law, flouting the judiciary, exceeding presidential authority, showing disregard for the separation of powers. One user on Reddit specifically pointed out that President Trump himself sharing content that depicted him as a king might have, reinforced the feeling that the slogan was appropriate.
So it's a rejection of a perceived style of leadership they see as dangerously monarchical, or at least authoritarian, trying to operate within a democratic framework. What were the movement's explicit goals then, according to the organizers? What did they hope to achieve?
Oh, their stated goals were several things. To reclaim Flag Day from what they saw as the administration kind of co-opting it, to reject authoritarianism, and to demonstrate what they felt democracy should look like. They framed it as building a movement powerful enough to sort of move past the current administration.
Yeah.
From a more traditional political angle, some participants definitely saw the goal as specifically electing more Democrats, to act as a legislative check on the presidency. And a crucial internal goal, it seems, was just activating the base of opposition, fighting voter apathy by showing people they weren't alone, that large-scale opposition existed.
That covers the perspective of the organizers and participants based on the sources. But of course, an event this significant is viewed and interpreted through many different lenses, and, well, not all of them are positive or agree with that narrative.
Exactly. And that's one of the most valuable things about looking across multiple sources. You really start to see these different angles emerge. So let's explore some of the critiques and alternative interpretations that were presented.
Okay. What were some of the main criticisms or concerns raised about the protests themselves, or maybe their potential impact?
Well, one recurring concern, particularly popping up in online discussions, was about the credibility of platforms like Reddit, where some of the information and, frankly, enthusiasm was being shared. There's this underlying worry that social media can sometimes inflate the perceived success or size of events that align with the platform's, dominant political leanings.
Right, the echo chamber effect. And what about the effectiveness of protests in general? Did that come up?
It did, yeah. Some sources expressed a kind of skepticism, arguing that protests can sometimes feel like screaming at clouds, that they might not actually translate into tangible political change or electoral success down the line. And this ties into a broader debate we found in the sources about whether sheer crowd size is actually meaningful in politics.
That crowd size argument is fascinating. Some sources argued it's practically meaningless for capturing national sentiment.
Yeah, using analogies, maybe a bit humorously, like trying to gauge the national popularity of cats versus dogs by counting who shows up at a pet expo. Kind of silly, right?
Right.
But then on the other hand, other sources strongly countered that crowd size is crucial, particularly for fighting apathy and inspiring potential voters, just by showing visible numerous support. They even pointed to President Trump's own consistent focus on crowd sizes at his rallies, comparing them to opponents' events as evidence that numbers do matter, at least in political messaging.
Yeah, it's a good point.
There was also comparison made to the 2017 Women's March, which had absolutely massive turnout, but according to some sources, didn't necessarily lead to significant legislative wins or concrete results afterwards. So the question of what does it achieve lingers.
Okay, so moving beyond critiques of the protests' form or effectiveness, one of the sources offered a completely different frame, this classical liberal reframe. This really shifts the perspective, doesn't it?
It certainly does. From this viewpoint, the question isn't just about whether the administration is acting kingly, but whether the protests are purely about defending constitutional liberty, or if maybe there are other incentives at play.
Other incentive.
Yeah, this perspective draws on ideas from public choice theory, which basically suggests that actors, including those within government or groups affiliated with it, often respond to incentives and self-interest, not always solely to, public spirit or abstract ideals.
So the argument here is that some of the protest organizers might have institutional reasons for being out there, beyond just pure ideological opposition.
Exactly. The source suggests that some progressive nonprofits and labor groups mentioned as organizers think ACLU, SEIU, Indivisible. They receive significant funding from government grants, or they rely heavily on bureaucratic programs for their existence and operations.
Okay.
So from this classical liberal perspective, their actions, their protesting, could be interpreted at least partly as rational responses aimed at protecting these existing structures, these funding streams, from potential streamlining, decentralization, or maybe budget cuts under a different administration.
And this ties into the idea that the kingly behavior being protested might, in part, be a reaction to something else entirely.
Yes. The provocative idea here is that the very large and powerful administrative state, the bureaucracy, with its complex regulations and control over significant funding streams, can itself start to resemble a kind of kingdom, operating with its own incentives for growth and self-preservation.
Oh.
So the source posits that the administration's actions, the ones perceived as kingly by protesters, might be seen from this angle as partly a pushback against this established administrative kingdom.
Wow, that's a really counterintuitive point. So the core classical liberal question posed by the source is...
It's pretty direct. Are these movements primarily defending constitutional liberty, or are they, at least in part, defending revenue streams and established bureaucratic power? And the particularly sharp thought from this perspective is, essentially, you cannot claim to oppose kings while defending kingdoms. Meaning, you can't legitimately fight against perceived authoritarian executive power if your movement is simultaneously, maybe implicitly, propping up or relying upon a large, unelected bureaucracy that, critics might say, also operates in ways outside traditional democratic checks and balances.
That reframe really forces you to look at the motivations from a very different angle. Okay, another area where the sources presented really sharp disagreements was the comparison of President Trump's immigration policies to President
Oh,
Obama's.
yeah, this was definitely a point of major contention in the materials we looked at. Some sources argue pretty forcefully that President Trump's use of ICE and deportations was essentially no different than President Obama's.
How do they support that?
They pointed to instances of similar headlines about immigration raids under both administrations. They even quoted President Obama saying, "If you come here and commit a crime, you will be deported," to argue that the underlying policy was basically the same. They claimed that Obama's raids were similar but were perhaps hidden by a friendlier media or just tacitly approved by Democrats at the time.
But others strongly pushed back on that idea.
Very strongly. They argued that it is fundamentally different. Now, while acknowledging Obama deported many people, the numbers were high back, they highlighted President Trump's specific tactics and his choice of targets, like going after students or legal residents who might have committed only minor infractions. They pointed to his perceived disrespect for due process, actions that reportedly violated court orders, and the use of the National Guard and Marines in cities as crucial distinctions. They also cited the perceived cruelty, using that deportation ASMR example again, and stating that while Obama deported many, he didn't, for example, send immigrants to supermax prisons abroad or end refugee programs in quite the same way.
So the difference in this view isn't just about the numbers deported, maybe, but in the method, the targets, and the perceived intent or attitude of the administration.
Exactly. It really shows how the same basic actions can be viewed through vastly different lenses depending on the surrounding context, the rhetoric, and the perceived motives behind them.
And speaking of context, historical context, one source added a little-known detail about the history of monarchism in the U.S., which feels surprisingly relevant to the whole "no kings since 1776" aspect of the protest.
It is a surprising detail, isn't it? The source notes that during the founding period, the idea of a monarchy was actually seriously considered by some. There were apparently proposals to make George Washington a king, discussions about inviting Prince Henry of Prussia, and Alexander Hamilton even floated the idea of an elective monarch for life.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, of course that didn't happen, and support for monarchy is extremely low in the U.S. today. But interestingly, polls show that while it's low, support has actually slightly increased over time from maybe 3% in 1950 up to around 12% in 2023. It's still tiny, but that little historical and polling detail adds, well, a layer to the "no kings since 1776" slogan.
That really does add an unexpected dimension to the conversation. Okay, finally, let's touch on the sensitive topic of political violence, which came up in the sources, particularly related to the LA protests and also that Minnesota shooting that happened just before the rallies.
Right, this is a difficult but important area the sources discussed. They presented differing claims about whether, left-wing or right-wing activists are responsible for more recent political violence in the U.S. Examples cited included things like January 6th, Charlottesville, various riots, school shootings linked by some to specific activist ideologies, and attacks on politicians like Paul Pelosi or attempts on President Trump.
So pointing fingers in different directions.
Pretty much. And the specific police actions and reported injuries at the LA protests also fall under this umbrella of discussing violence surrounding political events. The context of that Minnesota shooting of lawmakers just before the rallies was also mentioned, understandably raising concerns about targeting.
And one source offered a much broader, more systemic take on the issue of political violence.
Yes, that source argued that this kind of violence is ultimately enabled by past actions and policies from both major political parties, and that it serves the interests of capitalists by repressing the working class. They even went so far as to call for the creation of a socialist working class party as a potential counterforce.
So we see a real range of views, from attributing violence to specific groups to seeing it as a symptom of much deeper class conflict. Okay, shifting gears slightly, another major angle presented in the sources is understanding these protests through the lens of community organizing theory. How does that perspective help us make sense of this?
Well, this connects the No Kings events to broader academic research on how social movements actually function and, hopefully, achieve their goals. For instance, sources cited the work of Erica Chenoweth. Her research famously suggests that nonviolent movements with broad participation across society tend to be much more successful in achieving their objectives than violent ones.
That makes sense. And there's the concept of free spaces, too.
Right, that idea coming from researchers like Evans and Boyd, highlights the importance of informal spaces, community centers, churches, even just people's living rooms, as places where individuals can build relationships, share knowledge, and develop a collective identity and political consciousness, sort of from the ground up, independent of formal political institutions.
Then there's the distinction that Jane McAlevey makes between different types of organizing. That seemed important.
Very important. McAlevey contrasts mobilizing, which is more about getting short-term turnouts for specific events, like a protest rally, with what she calls deep organizing.
Deep organizing.
Yeah, deep organizing involves extensive base building, developing relational power through lots of one-on-one conversations and building community connections, and really nurturing leadership that emerges organically from within the affected communities. She argues that achieving truly transformative change requires this deeper, more relational approach, often emphasizing the strategic power of methods like, well, labor strikes.
Okay, so bringing these different theories together, what kind of principles for successful movements seem to emerge from the sources?
The sources suggest that effective movements often use a kind of hybrid strategy combining the agility of local grassroots action with the ability to influence things at a national level. Balancing immediate mobilization, like the No Kings rallies, with a real long-term vision and the capacity to adapt is also seen as key.
And those relationships seem crucial.
Absolutely. Prioritizing relational power, the connections and trust built within communities, is seen as crucial for sustaining momentum over time. And successful movements often find a balance between disrupting the status quo, making noise, and building alternative institutions or power structures, while trying to avoid getting bogged down in bureaucracy or focusing too much on abstract ideology that's disconnected from what people actually need.
It's interesting that grassroots organizing is being discussed so much in this context because historically it's often been associated more with the left, hasn't it?
It has, traditionally. And the sources note an interesting shift here. While historically linked to movements like labor and civil rights, grassroots strategies are increasingly being adopted and, frankly, effectively utilized by conservative groups now. To influence local governance, think about school board elections, anti-mandate protests, groups like Moms for Liberty. This really complicates the traditional understanding of grassroots action as being inherently liberal.
That's a really important point. And the role of labor specifically in these No Kings protests was pointed out too.
Yes, labor groups like SEIU and Indivisible were mentioned either as direct organizers or as being affiliated with the movement in some way. In Los Angeles specifically, the context of recent union strikes, SEIU 721, UAW 481 was noted, and some sources highlighted calls within the labor movement for unions to leverage their power, including the strike weapon, to support not just these protesters, but broader working-class goals.
So we've journeyed from the specific events on June 14th, through the motivations and the grievances. We've explored various political and historical interpretations, and finally looked at the underlying organizing theories. What does all of this mean for you, the listener, trying to make sense of it all?
Well, navigating an event like the No Kings protests, it can feel overwhelming, right? You encounter news reports, social media blowing up, think pieces, academic articles. It's really easy to get lost or feel like you're only seeing one tiny piece of the puzzle.
And often those pieces seem to contradict each other.
Exactly. So this deep dive is designed to offer you, hopefully, a shortcut. By pulling from this diverse stack of sources, we try to distill the key information and present the different perspectives side by side. It gives you, we hope, a much richer, more nuanced picture than you'd likely get from relying on any single news outlet or social media feed.
Yeah, it helps you see not just what happened, but maybe why people felt compelled to act, how different groups are interpreting the meaning and the potential impact of the events, and even the theoretical underpinnings of the organizing efforts themselves.
And understanding events like the No Kings protests, its roots, its many facets, and the different ways people are interpreting it is pretty crucial, we think, for being a well-informed participant in today's world. It equips you to recognize the different forces, the different arguments, and the theoretical frameworks that are constantly at play in our political discourse.
So we've explored the No Kings protests from multiple angles, from the reported events on the ground to political analysis, historical context, and the theories of organizing.
Yeah, it certainly leaves us with a lot to consider about power, resistance, the rule of law, and maybe the very definition of democracy in the U.S. today.
And here's a final thought, maybe building on that classical liberal perspective. If the core principle of No Kings is a rejection of perceived absolute or authoritarian power, What does it mean when one perspective from the sources argues that the protest movement itself might be influenced by institutional self-interest? Or that the very bureaucracy they might seek to protect sometimes acts in ways that resemble the concentrated power they claim to oppose?
Something for you to think about as you continue your own deep dives into the events shaping our world.